welcome to all of you. In this first part, let me make a little bit some, yeah. So in this first part, we are going to discuss neutrality, independence, impartiality of the ICS, 100 years of success and failure, individual experiences of serving and retired civil servants. That's you and new civil servants too. And actually, I didn't know a lot of this topic, but I was talking with you yesterday, and I went a little bit more in depth today about this. Very, very interesting, and I'm very keen to actually know. First question, perhaps to the more experienced of you. What was said to you when you signed up in the UN system for a job? What was said to you about obligation or not obligation of neutrality, independence? Was this a topic at that moment when you started your job at the UN? Perhaps Mr. Tapiola from the ILO, if you can start.
Yes, well, the answer, my answer is simply nothing. Nobody gave me instructions. I mean, most of the things you have to work out yourself. But I suppose that is what happens in work life anyway. Gradually, you come. I mean, you always come up to the question of neutrality, but everyone wants you to be neutral. Everyone wants the international civil servant to be neutral, but they also want him or her to agree with them. And that is the problem.
And you have many people to agree with, if I understand.
You see, if I'm looking at it from the point of view of the ILO, so it's easy to say that I have always been in jobs where basically I have an alibi for being neutral from governments. But then I come from the workers' group. And then I've got somewhere behind there's a group which always has expected me to behave in a certain way. And finding, the balance between that and getting a sensible outcome is not one of the easiest things.
But right. So your job was to be dependent of this, of the working group, actually. You had to represent them. So you were not really neutral.
You see, for most of the time, I think that they thought that I was representing them, and I thought that my basic task was to make them understand what is the best decision in their interest, which they did not always immediately see.
Todd Howland, thank you. Todd Howland. You are working at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Same question for you. What is your perception of this obligation of neutrality? Were you aware of this when you started at the very beginning in your job? Was it something that you were just discussing, at least with yourself, perhaps?
Well, I think it's a really good question, because I've never considered myself to work for a neutral organization. Because coming in and being recruited by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, we have 10 treaties that are our collective values. And so I always felt that I worked for a value-based organization. And that certainly the relationships with member states have always been a bit complicated, because these member states have signed on voluntarily to these treaties. And so the basis of our relationship is that normative framework. But it is a difficult one, because I can't tell you how many times I've been called by, let's say, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, asking me what I'm doing. And that I usually take that as an opportunity to explain, well, I'm doing my job. because you've signed on to these treaties. But it is a very difficult one because I think oftentimes people, we confuse the concept of neutrality. And because it reflects different parts of what we do, but it doesn't reflect us. I mean, neutral was we're not like going nowhere. We should be going somewhere. So, but I do want to say that it was 31 years after my first job in the UN that I signed the oath of civil service. So it did take a little while for that formal process to reach me.
And when you signed it, you were persuaded that it was anyway not neutral, or?
Well, we had actually really good, it was when I was representative of OHCHR in Colombia. We had a very good discussion about the issue of neutrality at that time, because it reflects how we should relate to the, let's say, the stakeholders, the member states, and how they should relate to us. But, we're very clear, especially at our office, we're a values-based organization, and I think people understand that when they start.
Thank you. Prisca, Chaoui, you are really at the center, at the convergence of these questions concerning all the civil servants. You are the executive secretary of the UNOG staff coordinating council and staff. How do you feel, what's the real importance in your view of these three values, again, independence, impartiality, and neutrality? Is it really something that is of core importance in the UN system, or can you forget it in a certain way?
So thank you very much for this question. I mean, for me, as John has said in his introduction, the ICSC, it's the core of the multilateralism. And when you see what is the three values, which are neutrality, independence, and impartiality, for me, it's part of what we have to be as international civil servant. This being said, if you see the history, and then we mentioned, how it's evolved, how it started, what was requested from us, what was the ideas of Drummond's, and where we are today, you just question. And this is not because of us as international civil servants, but if I may say, it's because of the pressures, the financial pressures that being put on the organization, that is making a lot of these value not shrinking, but I can say that they are no more strong like before. I give you an example. When you have like some department like OCHA, which are like 90% based on extra budgetary funds, and then you need the program to go ahead till the end, and you need to have senior manager trying to get the money by all means. I'm not saying by dirty means, but by all means. So at a certain point, if you want the organization to continue, this neutrality, in a way, independence and impartiality, is being put into question. If you want to continue to serve the organization, which is, as John has said, Todd has said, is an organization based on values. And these values are at the core of our work. But I have to say that the pressure that is being exerted on us today isn't making our work as easy as it should have been.
Thank you. And now I turn to the younger generation. Arabella, Comyn. So you are intern at the United Nations Environment Program and member of the FAIR Internship Initiative. So these values, is this really a concern for you? Is this something that you reach for in this job, or is it just a side, a lateral kind of values, and what you want actually is a job at the United Nations?
You mean the value of neutrality?
Yeah.
I think it's a difficult conversation to have, because I agree with what you said about it being, in my mind, more of a value-based organization as opposed to necessarily at its heart the UN being a neutral organization. And I think part of what comes into that is how you understand neutrality, because the neutrality that I think the UN should embody is a more proactive neutrality, something that is visible in, for example, the responsibility to protect doctrine. And I think that is something that I am interested in. I think that joining an organization like the UN, where everything is supposed to be based on these core values, I think it's necessary to remain neutral for political purposes, but ultimately the goal and the aim of the organization is to protect the values upon which they're based and around which the work is focused. And so, although neutrality is important, it is not, for me, necessarily the be-all and end-all. I think the values and upholding them and making sure that the work truly reflects those values is more important than necessarily being true neutral in all cases.
Thank you. Now, Enkel Leskaj, you are from the University of Geneva.
Yes.
And you're currently conducting a Master of Advanced Studies in European and International Governance. So what is your take? You have a more global view, if I understand, a little bit exterior view of what's going on with these type of questions. What's your view of the importance of these values today in the system?
Well, thank you. I'm in a stage in my career where I'm getting to learn about these values. I'm neither a retired civil servant nor an active one. We have a class, for example, with Professor Brownie where we go in depth about issues like this. But in my perspective, I think that there are some global challenges right now, like climate challenge, cybersecurity. And when you think about them, you start thinking that these challenges will promote neutrality because it's the only way to address them. So if you're thinking from a country's perspective still, or if you're getting influence from a country's perspective, how do you deal with climate change? It's in the door of everybody. How do you deal with cybersecurity? In my mind, also in my generation's mind, I guess, neutrality is kind of given. You have to have it embedded in your values, and I think we kind of start from that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So in certain way, you're talking about common interest for these very important issues. At the same time, the stakes are so high that the positions, for sure, of the different states are very, very different, and the trend is, as we saw in the survey, is to put some pressure on the international civil servants. And this is my question now to those having experience inside of the UN system. How did you experience those pressure? We could see that in the survey, I guess 100% of those who were for a longer time in the system experienced pressure, and the younger ones less. So first question, perhaps, is it because the younger ones have less experience and had less opportunity in the time frame to be under pressure, or is it that it has changed from your time at the very beginning and now where there is less pressure? So perhaps Mr. Tapiola.
Yes, well, I don't think that it reflects some change. It's just rather normal that if you take the elder generation, so they're more liable to be in positions where they have been directly under pressure. It does not always come to junior or medium level, but it certainly comes to the highest, to the top level. It does, and it has to come. It's normal. In a organization like the ILO, so you have certain. You have the whole body of standards, and then you come under pressure when governments don't like the way that their behavior is being interpreted. And then they start putting pressure on to find, let's say, the interpretation that they would like to have. Well, it's part of the whole exercise. If you know what you're dealing with, you know how far you can go. You can think of how much flexibility there is in each of the issues. You can try to work it out from the outcome or so on. But there's also 4 organizations like the ILO. I started my professional career and political professional career in the 1960s, early 70s, when we were often, and I come from Finland, so we were often criticized for that in the Cold War period we did not take very straightforward positions regarding a little neighbor that we had, the Soviet Union. We had a president at the time who said that, in this world, there are people, you need both judges and you need doctors. And maybe our role is easier. It's easier to be a judge, to be a doctor instead of a judge. This was a Cold War period. And now that we have come to a different period, I am more and more starting to think that we need to find a way of reconciling these two, of both being able to do the analysis honestly, saying what is wrong. Your interlocutors will not necessarily like it. Sometimes they will put pressure. They will put a lot of pressure. But then if you start explaining how you could actually solve this question, then you might find another way than, let's say, the traditional judgmental approaches, because they are the ones that provoke political pressure. Now, you take the whole issue of child labor that was discussed over the last 30 years. Governments first said, we don't have the problem, and don't come and put pressure on us. And finally, we got into a point where actually the governments wanted to work on that issue, because that was for them a way of showing that they are doing things right in an acceptable way.
So that means that the pressure came from the UN system on the governments, that they could respond and show that they were doing the job, actually. For an organization, and I think this goes also for the High Commissioner on Human Rights and so on, I mean, there has to be pressure that comes from the organizations on the governments. And of course, the pressure doesn't come from the Secretariat. It comes from the member countries. So in a way, the countries are pressuring one another. But you have to be able to kind of navigate that in a way that you turn it into an issue of, well, how do you want to solve this question? One feels a lot of experience behind all what you're saying here. Mr. Howland, could you give us one example on your side of pressure that you improved, that you were under? You are in a very sensitive, you're dealing with very sensitive subject, human rights. So I guess that pressures there can be pretty high. How is it, do they become real? What kind of pressure do you have? Do you have a call from this and this state, which state, to ask you what, and what can you do? What do you do? What don't you do?
Well, again, like my colleague from the ILO, I think it's actually normal. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the position that we're in. But we have to be ready for it. And I think one of the problems that we have is that, to a large degree, once you get beyond the civil service, a lot of people that are appointees aren't necessarily ready in terms of their defense of our own principles. And that's where we end up having problems. I think that, to a large degree, I give you an example. I mean, one time I was in Colombia, in Cauca, one of the departments, and we were visiting an indigenous group, and that there was a firefight between the FARC and the government, and that it was unfortunate to be stuck in the community, but it was the community that has been feeling this, not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. So then the media got a hold of me and said, "Oh, we heard you were in the middle of this firefight." And I said, "Yes, for the people in this particular Indian community or indigenous community, it's normal. It's like having fighting in their backyard. Something like Syria that you see on TV." And then I got a call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, "How dare I compare Colombia to Syria?" And I said, "Oh, I'm very sorry. I'll write an op-ed explaining what I meant," which I did. And so every time she'd call, then I would write an op-ed in one of the main newspapers in the country explaining my point. And so then she didn't call as often. Because, it was true for the people living in the middle of conflict. It wasn't because Bogota was so removed from the armed conflict at that moment that it was hard for people to understand that you actually did have areas that were affected weekly, if not daily, by the armed conflict. So it was very important to put out that that was happening and that these implicate human rights violations. So, it's not an easy thing. It's not like she became my best friend. But I think that there was a respect there because we didn't back down. And I think we back down way too often today in our organization, especially at higher levels, because people come in when ask, "Well, you came into the organization." I knew I came into a values-based organization. I'd studied for it. This is something I wanted to do. I had an experience for it. I was excited about the opportunity. But that the people who are appointed at the highest levels come in for political reasons. And I think that makes it very difficult if they're also not ready to defend those values, that then you see that the member states find it easier to push, and then it creates limited space on ourselves in terms of functionaries.
So, thank you very much. Mrs. Chaoui, you have a kind of cross-cutting of the UN population from the very top to the down. Do you think the values are well defended today by, let's say, the Secretary General and the staff in the General Secretary? How are the values diffused into the staff today?
To say that I can talk about myself when I joined the UN. I mean, I come from a developing country, and then since my childhood I used to dream to be working in the UN, and I joined the UN because of these values that the UN has been preaching and is preaching, and I used to see it was for me the accomplishment of my life. And then when I entered and I started discovering what's going on, I got disappointed. I still believe in the UN today, but unfortunately, it's, as de Gaulle used to call it, le gros machin. And it's not, it's a heavy bureaucracy today, I have to say. I would approve what my colleague said about the political appointment, and also what Kari said, mainly the pressure. I won't feel it as a middle level staff, but you have a lot of political pressure, and you have more and more political appointees in the senior level, and these appointees are not probably not the one who really embraced all the values of the UN, like the young generation. And I was in a way happy when I saw the result of the survey, because it gives some hope, because the new generation is coming with another way of looking at the UN. And again, even if you have a top management who is not really embracing the value, but you have the grassroots embracing it, it's already for me hope. And I know we have like different generation, but you have young generation, middle generation, and I think the UN, despite all the difficulties that is going through now because of the geopolitical challenges, because of all the economical challenges, because we are really not very happy financial situation, I think the UN, the young generation can still push for the values, and the value will remain in the organization, and the international civil servant will be the main vehicle behind this value. So my message is, even if we have senior management who really don't embrace all the values because of the political pressure they are under, you have middle staff, you have junior staff who can still lift up the organization and make it continue on the basis of the values for which it was put in place.
Thank you, Mrs. Comyn. So you are addressed by Mrs. Chaoui in a certain way. So you should defend those values. And are you ready in the future or today already? I don't know if you had already pressure in your at your stage, but are you ready to resist to those pressure? Do you think it's a priority, or you talked about neutrality being not absolutely the absolute value that you wanna that you think is at the root of your engagement? So, how do you feel considering all those pressures?
I think it's absolutely essential to defend the values at the core of the UN. It's one of the reasons actually I'm a member of Fair Internship Initiative and trying to actually get the UN to truly walk the talk on the values that supposedly it defends. So for me, yes, I mean, everything I do is, in my mind, in somehow contributing to the realization of the values that I hold dear and which align quite well with the UN's values. And so I haven't, at this point, as a young intern, experienced any pressure to truly defend those. I've been very lucky to have supervisors that have supported me in my participation in climate activism, in my Fair Internship Initiative work. But I can understand that moving forward, getting into more senior positions as opposed to potentially more middle management, it does become more difficult to defend those and more delicate to defend them as well. But I think that, I mean, if you don't defend them, it's almost like they don't exist and they're not serving any purpose at all. So, yeah. Okay,
thank you. Let's perhaps be a little bit more general and go to the main question of this panel. So, failures and successes of these 100 years of international civil service. You studying this question. What, in your view, is, I don't know, I'll let you the choice. Do you want to start with failures, which is very negative, or successes?
Well, sorry.
Yes.
I might give you an overview of whatever we studied at school, but I'd rather not, because there are people who are much more qualified than me and can bring real experience in here. So I would call a success of the UN the reason why I'm here, actually, in Geneva, because there's a reason for that. And I've been here for 2 months. I'm studying European international governments, and I aspire to be part of the UN next year when I graduate. The reason for that is exactly because of the values that you were talking about before. Prior to this education, I was studying business, and my system of values back then was completely different. If you would ask me what my ambition would be, it would be to make a lot of money and, go to an island. And then I grew up a little bit, and I understood that that's really not very fulfilling on the long run, philosophically, like speaking. So then I was trying to find a way to make myself fulfilled and feel important. And I decided that this table here in Geneva and the values which you were talking before are worth being part of and worth defending if ever there's a time when they're put into question, so.
Is there anybody else in the panel who can tell us about success, failure? Yes? Is it, Tapiola?
Yes, I mean, we seem to love to look at our failures, but, if you look back, either 100 years or the UN, there's a general body of shared values which did not exist. It did not exist before 1919. it's got different elements there. If I look at it from the ILO's point of view, you have issues like forced labor, child labor, you have discrimination, you have, well, child labor is a very good example. Still about 30 years ago, governments could get away with just saying, look, this is cultural, this is development, this is, you know, we can't afford it. They still sometimes get away with forced labor, saying that, well, we can't afford it, we don't have the money, we don't, and there are solutions. But by and large, we have a consensus that certain things should not be done. Child labor should not be used. Forced labor, which was the normal thing in colonies, should not be exacted. Discrimination is wrong. These things that really were seen then at the time of the Second World War with labor camps and racial discrimination, and so on. There's a belief that it is wrong. Take South Africa. It took 30 years. It took over 30 years, but it got solved. Now, whether then the solution is ideal, so that's a different thing. But there's a whole list of things that have got solved because of these joint shared values of the multilateral organization and the different mechanisms that we have there. So let's not forget
Thank you
it.
for this positive take of what was done in the area where you were in. And I was wondering if in the human rights, this sense of consensus is also a truth, and if the progress are real. I mean, could you have the same type of agreeing about death penalty being not a good way to punish people and become a consensus, or are we much further away from a consensus on these type of topics than on child labor, for example? I don't know if my comparison is very good, but how is it looking?
No, I'll give you an example from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was representative of our office, because it's an interesting dynamic within the interactions of the Security Council and what was happening on the ground, is that we had 22 offices throughout the country when I was representative there, and we were getting reports from a few different offices that then when they would go to massacre sites and mass rape sites, that they were finding UN rations. And so we started looking at this, and because at that point in time, the Security Council had, in one of its resolutions, indicated that the UN should be providing support to the FARDC, the army of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so we did further research, and we saw that, in fact, we were just simply providing rations to all members of the FARDC. And so we began a process of documenting the massacres and what we were finding in terms of UN supplies. And that we took this investigation all the way through our own, through the UN peacekeeping mission there and to the Security Council. And we were able to get a new resolution passed that, people don't like the word condition, but conditioned the support of the FARDC based on their level of respect for human rights. And so we created a whole, let's say, documentation system that would show that officers that had not been engaged in human rights violations did get support. Officers that had been engaged in human rights violations did not get support and would not get support until there was actually a criminal investigation relative to their actions. That was a very difficult and painful effort over a couple of years. But that in the end, the values of the organization became the most important thing relative to our interaction with the state, and it actually has had a beneficial impact on the relationship and on the behavior of the FARDC. So I do think we can make progress, but that's not necessarily an easy path. But I did want to say something about failures, because I'm fairly new here to Geneva, and I have about 70 people that are in my branch, and I met every one of them, spent about an hour, and I was really very worried after spending that hour with all 70 of them about how they don't feel that they have a purpose, that they're related to the change the change values of our organization. And I haven't fully understood, where it's coming from, but we have a real problem because people aren't feeling that they're connected to those values, and they feel more limitation for one reason or another. And I'm working on it, but obviously it relates to their connection to the actual purpose and to the autonomy, that, given the autonomy they need to actually get to where they want to go. So, I think we can, and we have, and we'll continue to make progress, but I am a bit worried about, the condition of the civil service at this moment here.
Mrs. Chaoui, how are you feeling about this statement?
I just want to say that I like to see these things in a positive manner. And to answer your question, if the UN didn't exist, if the international civil servant weren't there, I don't think the world would have been where it is now. And I think I understand what he's saying, coming from the field to Geneva and seeing maybe staff in Geneva not really having the sense of purpose of the organization. But I think staff, what they're doing in the field is really great. Now, when it comes to the condition of service, and again, we used to be I am not going to dig into details, but I think some of you have heard what's going on here in Geneva about the salary cuts, about the shrinking of our condition of service. They are shrinking, unfortunately. They are shrinking because of many reasons, because the world is changing. The way member states are looking at the UN is changing, and I have to recognize that now some member states see the UN as this big machine that is not really able to advance and to do what it should have been doing, but it's doing a lot, unfortunately. And if you want to continue having the international civil servant continuing fighting, having a sense of, achieving the goals of the organization, you need to secure good condition of service for them. And I'm not going to enter into all the details, but all the conditions are getting every day. It's taking every day some small things. And I give you just an example. I was just recently in New York, and then I met, USG of management and other senior manager. And when I hear somebody like USG for management saying that we don't need, but it's not necessary to make your career from first day till the end in the UN. We don't need to have people on continuing contract all the time. We need to adapt ourselves to the external world, which has become a world of instability. Then if you bring these people on these conditions without any sense of appartenance, of being part of the organization, how you want them to give the best of them. You need to give them, I'm not saying the best condition of service, because we are an organization that has it has a lot of relevance when it works in the field, but you need to give me the minimum so that I can give you the minimum in return. When you come and you cut my salary 7%, all of a sudden unilaterally, how do you want to expect me to be all the time working with the same motivation? When you come and you tell me, I don't know, you just have to, but that your career in the UN, you have to do everything to get a promotion, because I'm sorry to say it, we are in what I call still a caste system. When you have some staff working on the general service, what we call in the UN, other on a P, other D, this is no more the word of today, And you have a lot of people who are competent, who join the organization with a lot of desire to contribute, and the system, how it's now, it's killing them. It's a system, for me, I'm sorry to use this word, it's a caste system where for God's sake, you have somebody, because he's directed, he's more valuable than a professional, or a professional more valuable than an assistant. All of us, we contribute to the UN today. All of us, we should continue to contribute, but we need also our organization to protect our condition of service. And member states need to know this very clearly, that our condition of service are very important if you want to continue serving the organization like we should.
Thank you. Strong words. Mr. Tapiola, I have two questions for you. First, to which caste do you belong? And second, are the rights of the labor respected in the organization itself? Because if I listen to Mrs. Chaoui, we are kind of an edge here.
Well, when I came into the ILO, I was recruited as Deputy Director General, so I suppose that answers much of the case, or where I would belong.
Peace here, yeah.
But I recognize the problem, and there are some other elements to the problem also. We are discussing, and I think we should, that's normal, discussing as if everyone would be really a top-notch, first-class civil servant. And then we look at the different ways in which people are recruited into the organization, political recruitments from certain governments. There are other things. I've always been fascinated with the fact that both governments and others, they've got the they very often want to get rid of their internal problems by sending these problems to the international organizations. Then they send these problems to the international organizations, and then they complain that the international organizations don't function properly. I mean, you can't have it both ways. And we have, it's very difficult to talk about it, because there are a lot of people who, in a way, end up without, you can't blame people. I mean, but we do have deadwood. And we don't have really methods of getting rid of deadwood. So, and then when we get into situations where budgets have to be cut, you end up by cutting those that you actually would need. But this is a fairly normal normal situation. As to labor conditions, I think that the conditions, if you compare them with international labor standards, by and large are good. But then, let's not forget one thing. We have had discussions on having collective bargaining and so on. All right. I've been involved in discussions on collective bargaining in the ILO. Coming myself from the trade union side, I've often had to say that, look, it doesn't exist. You can't. Because if you really want to bargain about wages and working conditions, the basic ones, you need to bargain with the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly. And your Director General or Head of Personnel does not have the latitude as a private entrepreneur has, or even public. So, it's actually, I can't see what the actual model of collective bargaining would be. I believe that in areas of consultation, negotiating different issues. There's a lot to be done. And we have active unions, we have active staff unions, which by and large do a good job. Sometimes they seem to forget that they are not actually in a position to be trade unions in the way that trade unions are out there in the world. And if you read about trade unions in the French press and compare that to the public service, you may come to very strange conclusions. But
Thank you. Mr. Howland, last question for you, and then we go to the audience. You mentioned that you're pretty recent in Geneva and that you made these discussions with all your staff. And is this lack of sense of purpose in the teams, is this a speciality, if I could say, of Geneva, or do you find that a little bit everywhere in the world? And what can you do against that? Is it inside the system, or is it to what is it linked, really?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's exclusive to Geneva, but I think it's a very bad case here. And why do I say that is because, if we look at studies on motivation, it's about autonomy, it's about purpose, it's about mastery, and you'd think, wow, the United Nations should be really easy at this. I mean, it should be just like exactly what we do. I mean, you even have gray cells, they keep doing their work after they're not paid, right? Because it relates to autonomy, purpose, and mastery. And somehow, within our own organization, we're killing this ability for people to connect to that purpose, to have the autonomy they need, and to really support them developing the tool set to be, really good at what they do. And so I think that there's something there, and there's so many factors that relate to it. And if you see it in the field, I would say it's because it becomes more of a job, and because it relates to a business model. Because people, they'll lose their purpose if they take first getting the funds to keep their project going. And so we've created a very difficult circumstance in terms of business model, especially in the development areas, because it's a very different way of funding than in peacekeeping or the humanitarian. But that in development, it's often from specific donors or the member state themselves. And this creates, a problem and confusion between us and McKinsey. Because if we have a business model that's about maintaining the money, or do we have a business model that relates to supporting and actively pursuing the goals and values of our organization? And that's a problem because once you have a job, you want to keep your job. And so we have a real contradiction because of often the business model that we're pursuing. But in Geneva, where a lot of people actually receive money from the regular budget, and the regular budget hadn't really been under threat until recently, the problem seems to really be their connection. Their connection to purpose is that, the bureaucracy spins around and they do what they're supposed to do, but they've lost a connection to how they're helping to facilitate a change. And then they get disheartened because they've been in the same position for 15 years and they're not seeing how they're progressing. And so but you can make a difference if you connect people better and you create partnerships between what people are doing here and what people are doing in the field, and you begin to show that there's an interrelationship. You can do it, but that it's not. We really do have a serious problem. But, at least some of us are working on it.
Thank you. So I give you the floor, but one more question to the younger audience. Listening to what you just listened, what's the state of your motivation here?
I've actually received the advice that I should not stay in the UN and that I should instead go to the NGO or the private sector, see what it's like there, maintain my ambition, and then come back when I'm a little bit older and ready to slow down because the bureaucracy is slow. So that's always interesting and something to consider. One thing I would like to just briefly say about what you said, Carl, labour standards might be good for staff, but for consultants and for interns, unfortunately, they're not that great and need to be improved. Have to say that, sorry. But in terms of motivation, it is something that I am considering and that I need to think about. And I think that everyone who are coming into this do need to think about, because it's one thing to really internalize the values that you think the UN are working towards and wanting to do that, and then to come into it, and perhaps I've heard that it's more an issue with headquarters than in the field, because there's this kind of disconnect with actually seeing what you're working on actually be realized. And I've honestly felt that a little bit with myself. Some of the work I've been doing is very much at a broad UN system kind of coordination policy level, and that feels too abstract to really connect to what I want to do and what feels like it's making a real change. And I do feel like that part of the problem with that is the bureaucracy and the reality of needing to have this kind of consensus-based decision making, because we can't just, as the UN, say, well, based on our values and based on all of these universal charters, this is what you need to do, and so you're going to do it. It's obviously not that simple, and it shouldn't be that simple, because that then becomes obviously a bit of a global dictatorship, not good. But it's definitely also a struggle and something that I personally don't have an answer for myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have one word on this? Short word?
Yes. Whatever the faults of the UN, it still remains the only organization that does what it does. So I really want to be part of that, but I think I will not start from Geneva, though. I think,
But you're here now.
I am here now, and I'm getting an academic preparation, but I think I would rather go to the field first. I'm still young, dynamic, and see what's going on there. I've seen the UNDP, for example. I've worked a little bit with the UNDP back in my country, and I really like the concept there. So I think I'll start from there, and then see in the future, come back and see what's going on in here. Maybe
Okay,
improve.
thank you.